Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Zoe, a member of the ICCT communications team. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the recording to all participants sometime next week. Everyone has their microphones on mute. If you have questions, you can write them in the questions box in the control panel to the right of your screen. After the presentation, we'll have some time to answer questions from the audience. Today, we are going to talk about decarbonizing the US domestic fleet, the future of the Jones Act, presented by Elise Sturrup, Jonathan Lewis, and Madeline Rose. To begin our presentations, I would like to introduce Elise to discuss Jones Act shipping case studies, feasibility of US domestic green corridors with hydrogen and wind assist. Thank you, Elise.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today. As Zoe said, my name is Elise Sturrup. I'm a researcher with our marine team based in Washington, D.C. And my focus is U.S. policy and the next generation of fuels for maritime shipping. Today in my presentation, I'd like to marry two concepts, green corridors and decarbonizing the U.S. flag fleet, especially the Jones Act ships. Based on my research I'll be sharing with you, there is ample opportunities for cleaning up U.S. shipping. Next slide. First, let me break down just some key aspects of the Jones Act and why I chose to focus on them for this work. Next slide. Our colleagues at UMass, University College London, and Ocean Conservancy produced a report looking into the distinguishing characteristics of the Jones Act fleet versus the whole US flag fleet. There's about 181 US flagged, self-propelled, over 1,000 gross tons ocean-going vessels. I know those are a lot of quantifiers, but these are important because there's hundreds of barges in the US flag fleet, but not all propelled. And there's some data sets that count Great Lakes vessels and some do not. But for simplicity, I'll stick to the 181 US flag ships. And based on the qualifiers on screen for the Jones Act identified by UMass, those ships can be narrowed down to 98 vessels designated as the Jones Act fleet. Next slide. So we have less than 100 ships in the Jones Act fleet, and I started to dive into one of their most standout features, their age. Many of these ships are nearing or past their scrappage ages, and this is especially true for freshwater vessels that don't degrade as quickly in freshwater. And due to the decline of the US shipbuilding industry, there has not been enough turnover to replace the aged out vessels. The hallmark of the Jones Act is that they're responsible for cabotage or trade within United States domestic ports. In other words, these vessels are advanced ages, but their routes, these domestic trade routes, will still need to operate using this fleet of ships. Next slide. The peculiar scenario that is this aging yet necessary fleet can be paired with the constantly evolving environment for clean shipping, creating unique opportunities to decarbonize the Jones Act fleet. Next slide. First off are the energy efficiency technologies. Many US ports have shore power, so there's an opportunity there. And to clean their exhaust, many US flagships have opted to install scrubbers. We've debunked scrubber efficiency a few times, so I'll focus on wind assist. There's an array of wind assist technology out there. Rotor sails, which is pictured on the slide, wing sails, kite sails, suction sails, essentially any apparatus on deck that harnesses the wind a ship experiences while on the high seas and converts that into usable energy, shaving off the energy demands of the ship. Next slide. On top of technologies, the US fleet is transitioning to cleaner fuels. Many have made the transition to LNG, but there's potential for methane slip. And biofuels are a sticky area, given the feedstock of the fuel can outweigh any benefit the fuel itself may have in lowered emissions. Those top three boxes are kind of the next generation of maritime fuels, which are based on renewable electricity production. I love batteries, but many Jones Act routes are too far to use them as an option. And while ammonia is on the rise as a concept, one still has the consideration of nitrous oxide emissions to capture and the whole toxicity part. So that lands on hydrogen, and specifically a renewable electricity producing liquid hydrogen via fuel cells. These are all players in a clean US fleet, but some are definitely better than others. Next slide. I think hydrogen is a unique opportunity for US flagged vessels due to recent investment in the hydrogen economy. Seen on screen here are hydrogen stakeholders as identified by the Department of Energy. The United States is indicating confidence in a hydrogen economy, rolling out programs such as the $8 billion Hydrogen Hub program, initiated by the funding released from passing the bipartisan infrastructure law, and tax credits for qualified hydrogen production. Here at ICCT, we've been looking closely into these developments and hope it has potential to decarbonize hard to abate sectors just like maritime. Next slide. One last opportunity is the flurry of announcements the last few years we have seen on green corridors. There aren't many domestic shipping corridors, but between countries like China and California, there has been several announcements and memorandums. So it's a trend the US fleet can leverage while utilizing the incoming hydrogen economy. Next slide. All right, hopefully I've set the stage for you all for why I'm looking at these overlapping concepts. There's potential there. So I picked 4 Jones Act vessels and examined their feasibility of being powered by liquid hydrogen and contributing to a green domestic corridor. Next slide. So first things first, I'll be throwing around some terms and I wanted to clarify them. I analyzed based on 3 levels: a ship level, can this real life ship with its characteristics be feasible as a vessel to be powered by hydrogen? 2, the ship's completed legs, which is an individual instance between port A and port B. And a route is a collection of those legs between port A and port B, or port A to port C, etc. A corridor is a combination of ships and routes. It's a summary term to assess high-level demands of the collection of routes and vessels that fall within approximate regional designation. Next slide. So second thing, we focus on 2 energy efficiency technologies on these vessels' routes. And what I think is cool about our methodology is that we pair actual 2019 AIS data to matching weather conditions at that time. So not only can we see the ship's energy demands given our models using the AIS data, but we can use the wind's direction and flow to estimate a wind assist energy production. So we focused on the rotor sail, which we've modeled in a previous paper, and for the first time, a rigid wing sail. A key difference in those 2 technologies are their power inputs. We modeled the rotor sails needing power to spin to harness the Magnus effect, and we modeled the wing sails to be passive and need no additional energy. Next slide. And lastly, given our fuels team has been assessing renewable hydrogen production pricing in the US, we were able to estimate the fuel savings price of hydrogen for having a rotor or wing sail installed. As you can see, we're using the current estimation of renewable hydrogen production, but it's projected to be slashed in price in the coming decades. Next slide. So thank you for holding through those details. Here comes the fun part. What did we find in our report? Next slide. Well, our 4 ships were busy in 2019, that's for sure. Actually, their consistent routes and advanced ages are why I chose these 4 vessels to model. Based on their fuel and power demands, our SAVE model estimated how much CO2 these 4 ships produced in a year, which would be abated if they switched to zero-emission fuels. I also wanted a variety of routes and ship types, so we have a Great Lakes ferry option, a couple cargo ships up the West Coast, and a container vessel going all the way out to Hawaii, a community which the Jones Act directly affects. Next slide. There's a lot on this slide, so I want to draw attention to that green box. A ship, in theory, if gutted of its engine room and fuel tanks, has a remaining volume that could be replaced by hydrogen fuel storage and fuel cells. Based on that volumetric energy of liquid hydrogen, we can convert that of what a ship expels in energy in a leg to the hydrogen volume it would take to cover that demand. We then compare, does that demand fit within the capacity what we estimated? So not only do I point this out in terms of looking to the right and seeing that these energy demands are often covered by the capacity, but to point out our methodology is retrofits. We've got a 40-plus-year-old ships in this modeling exercise. I'm not a ship owner, but between retrofits and new builds, this is a conservative estimate based on the current ship specs. Also to say how these ships currently are running, and they can almost wholly accomplish their routes on hydrogen alone. And that would only become more possible with more efficient new builds. Next slide. So this may be me nerding out, but I loved our wind results because a rotor sail, mind you, we just modeled a single 30-meter high rotor sail, didn't always operate net positive energy all the time, given whatever wind angle and whatever the power it took to operate in that moment. But it did produce some of the higher reaching amounts of energy, like 200 kilowatts hours a year. The wing sail, on the other hand, didn't produce as much, but consistently had positive energy generation. So we found factors that impacted wind energy production, which you can see we broke the results up by, either by location, seasonality, and usually cooler months like in the winter or autumn saw the highest energy production for wind assist. Next slide. So not only location, but direction of the ship's routes affected the amount of energy produced from the sails. This is critical when we start going into the corridor conversations. Is a route beneficial to have wind assist based on the ship's or the route's directions? From our models, westward ships saw the highest energy production, which coincides with the US wind characteristics of east to west wind streams. Next slide. With all these routes in mind, this summary graphic identifies the 4 corridors we found using the model Jones Act fleet. I'll highlight the Pacific corridor connecting Washington, California, and Hawaii. Because of the volatility of the wind in these regions, we saw significant production of energy from the wing sails that saved 2 ships on that route nearly $500,000 a year in hydrogen fuel costs with just a single rotor sail. The corridors then can be matched up to hydrogen stakeholders and producers, such as what we identified with DOE, the hydrogen matchmaking tool, and the energy estimates that are also provided. This to all say these routes are feasible, but wind is a needed aspect in the conversation when tackling high alternative fuel costs. Next slide. So where does this leave us? Well, here are some of my paper's key takeaways. Next slide. Liquid hydrogen using fuel cells alone can decarbonize these cases of the Jones Act fleet. And given their ages, new builds with next generation fuels in mind may be a better match for the corridors rather than the retrofits. Second, the nuances when it comes to wind, what does that route specifically need? Consistent but lower energy, or more volatile but higher energy produced? Route level consideration will be key when deciding which wind assist to simulate on these corridors. And next slide. And wind is an important concept to have when looking into the next generation of Jones Act. The fuel savings are significant with just single sails, not to mention the potential multiplying effect with multiple sails we see on ships with installed wind assist. We need to take a look at domestic opportunities of green shipping corridors and connect the unique circumstances of the hydrogen economy, the aging fleet, and the political ambition currently to develop these networks of proved ambition. Next slide. So what's next? Jones Act is not something one paper can cover, so I hope to pursue more research looking into the total cost of a zero-emission vessel built in US shipyards and exploring our dying shipbuilding industry and how green steel and hydrogen can potentially lift it to produce a US clean fleet. Next slide. So thank you all for listening today. I appreciate your attention, and I am really excited to listen to my fellow panelists and engage in a Q&A afterwards. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Elise. I think I'm up next. I'm Jonathan Lewis. I'm the Director of the Transportation Decarbonization Program at the Clean Air Task Force. The Clean Air Task Force is a US headquartered but global climate organization that works to accelerate the development and deployment of climate-friendly technologies in an energy-hungry world. So the subtitle of today's discussion is the future of the Jones Act. And I'm going to talk about one very specific aspect of that future, and that is how the Jones Act interacts with a recent policy development and commercial development in the United States around the creation and build out of regional clean hydrogen hubs, which Elise mentioned briefly in her talk just now. I'm going to do two things before handing the microphone over to Madeline. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the US Hydrogen Hubs program, and then I'm going to run through a few of the examples of how hubs might interact with existing and perhaps new Jones Act vessels. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Hydrogen is key for reducing and eliminating emissions from some of the hardest to decarbonize sectors of the economy. In addition to serving as an energy carrier, it's going to be a feedstock. It's going to continue to be a feedstock for industrial purposes. And we need to do a couple of things. We need to make sure that it is directed to the subsectors of the economy that need it the most. We need to make sure that it's produced in ways that result in the lowest possible greenhouse gas emissions across the life cycle. So we think that moving hydrogen is challenging. Moving ammonia, which can be made from hydrogen by synthesizing hydrogen and nitrogen, is easier, but there are energy penalties in both directions. And so there are trade-offs in going to ammonia. You don't get the ease of shipment that you get from going to ammonia isn't cost-free. In any event, moving hydrogen or hydrogen carriers is difficult. So we think that most hydrogen is going to be used near the place where it's produced and transported via short pipelines. However, seaborne transportation of hydrogen or ammonia is possible, challenging, but it's doable. And we do see some opportunities to move hydrogen energy around the world and around the United States by vessel. Next slide, please. So in order to demonstrate and test the viability of hydrogen production, hydrogen storage, and transport hydrogen usage, CATF helped Congress conceptualize and develop the concept of regional clean hydrogen hubs. We were looking at some clusters and valleys they're often referred to in Europe, particularly Rotterdam and the Netherlands, and thinking about how those networks of hydrogen producers and users might be sort of engineered into existence through US policy. And so the objectives of the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub provision was to create localized epicenters for the production, transportation, storage, and use of hydrogen that are closely connected and co-located in the same region. The idea is to make a highly integrated market between producers and end users. And the provision in the IIJA, which was passed in November 2021, allocates $8 billion to DOE to fund at least 4 hydrogen hubs across the United States. The hubs must, says here separately, it's really kind of more collectively might be the better term, demonstrate low carbon hydrogen production from renewable, nuclear, and fossil fuel plus CCS based systems, and also demonstrate the use of hydrogen fuels in a handful of different offtake markets that include power, transportation, residential and commercial heating. So the requirement is DOE needs to put money into at least one hub that does at least one of those things. And so they need to fund at least 4. DOE is indicating that it's probably going to fund somewhere between 8 and 10. So we're likely to see, a strong handful of these around the country. And as you can see from the diagram here, the hubs are likely to include a handful of different upstream energy production systems that are either producing the electricity or the natural gas that's being used to produce the hydrogen. infrastructure for storing and moving that hydrogen from the production facilities to the end users, and then a variety of end users within that market, which might include truck depots, bus depots, ammonia production facilities, industrial facilities, and ports. And ports are obviously of specific interest to this discussion. Next slide, please. So here's a diagram of the DOE's hub program and where we're at. So as I mentioned, the program was initiated by the infrastructure bill in 2021. DOE has done a bunch of things, including notices of intents and FOAs and requests for concept papers, all of which the process has been a huge undertaking for the applicants, but the process is moving along more or less on pace. 79 hub regions originally applied for DOE funding. That was winnowed down to 33 applicants last winter. And then in April, those applicants submitted their full applications to the department for consideration. And now DOE is in contact with those applicants, running through those applications and going through the process of deciding which probably 8 to 10 hubs that they select for funding sometime this fall. So that's where we're at, sort of in the middle of this chart right now in terms of the process. Once they've identified the prospective awardees are going to negotiate the terms of the grant, and then the hubs will move into, they'll either initiate or accelerate their development processes. So in some regions of the country, the hub efforts are sort of piggybacking on initiatives that had already begun. In California, for example, there's work being done on a hydrogen hub that predated the prospect of support from the federal government. So US federal government funding would just accelerate or perhaps expand the effort in California. Next slide, please. So from the perspective of my organization, Clean Air Task Force, we are looking to do 3 things through our engagement around hydrogen hubs. We want to make sure that the hydrogen that's produced at the hubs has the lowest possible carbon intensity, and that means making sure that the electricity used in electrolysis processes comes from zero emitting generating sources, and that those sources are additional to the generating sources that are on the grid already, so that we're not sort of moving renewable energy from the grid to hydrogen production only to wind up with more, say, natural gas on the grid. We also want to make sure that natural gas-based processes for making hydrogen utilize natural gas from gas production fields and production facilities that have the lowest methane leak possible, and that the gas reforming facilities have maximum CCS applied. We also want to make sure that the benefits of using hydrogen in various end users are maximized. And that means sending them to areas that have few or no options for decarbonizing otherwise. And that includes a bunch of heavy industrial sectors, but also of great interest to my program at CATF, and includes a lot of the heaviest parts of the transportation sector. So that's long-haul trucking in some cases, aviation in some cases, pretty much every case, almost every aviation decarbonization technology requires more clean hydrogen. And again, most importantly for this discussion, it involves the shipping industry, whether you're using that hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cells, converting it to ammonia and running it through an internal combustion engine, or doing something else with that hydrogen. There are several other options. Those are areas where we think we need hydrogen, for which it should be prioritized. And finally, we want to make sure that the communities that live in and among these hub regions have a very prominent voice at the table in shaping what those hubs look like, what purposes they serve, how they're developed, and how they're managed over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does this all connect to shipping? There are 3 potential interactions that I'm ready to talk about today. Elise mentioned one already that it's not on my list. I'll get to that in a second, but clearly this is the list that I'm going to run through is a partial list. The three potential interactions that I'm going to describe is using the Jones Act to move hydrogen, ammonia, and other hydrogen-based products from hubs to other transportation markets inside the United States. Another is moving hydrogen-based products to other markets in the United States that are unrelated, they're not directly related to transportation. And the third, and perhaps the most interesting of the options that we're going to talk about today, is using hydrogen and ammonia or other hydrogen-based fuels to power Jones Act ships. So let's take those in order. So using Jones Act ships to move hydrogen, ammonia, and other hydrogen-based fuels from hubs to other transportations in the markets in the United States. So as I mentioned earlier, we think that hydrogen is going to play a major role in decarbonizing marine shipping, heavy-duty trucking, and aviation. We think that production is going to be, it makes sense to locate production and end uses as close as possible, but there's going to be some discrepancies, some dislocation in when and how that's possible. So low carbon hydrogen and ammonia, it's going to occur, the production is going to occur along different timelines. It's going to happen at different price points and different scales around the world and within the United States. And so the diagram in the background, which you can't really see, is a diagram of how CATF thinks that a ammonia shipping network, it's an ammonia shipping fuel network and zero carbon fuel powered shipping might sort of co-evolve together. That's going to happen, that's on a global scale, but it's also going to happen in the United States. Some parts of the United States are going to be developing low carbon hydrogen, low carbon ammonia as fuels more quickly than other parts. And so there's going to be some shuffling of that fuel around the country to match up production and demand. So as I said earlier, we think that hubs are going to mainly serve local demand, but there will be some trading opportunities. And two hypotheticals that are perhaps worth considering, just as hypotheticals, however, is that you can imagine as we develop green shipping routes around the world, perhaps one were to form between the Port of Savannah and the Port of Rotterdam. It's determined that ammonia-powered shipping is the best way to decarbonize that route. But Savannah doesn't yet have, or its access to decarbonized ammonia production is delayed. A regional hydrogen hub, perhaps one in Corpus Christi, Texas, might be able to produce hydrogen and ammonia more quickly and at a lower cost, at least for some time period, and it could export that ammonia to the Port of Savannah on a Jones Act covered ammonia tanker. Another hypothetical is you can imagine a refinery in St. Louis that is producing new fuels, perhaps in response to some of the incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, like the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Tax Credit. So perhaps this refinery is now producing more sustainable aviation fuel, which requires hydrogen for hydrotreating. So they need clean hydrogen to make that fuel, and they might source that hydrogen from Iowa, which has a bunch of different ways to make renewable-based hydrogen. And so if that hydrogen was loaded on a hydrogen barge or an ammonia barge in somewhere like Davenport and shipped down the Mississippi to St. Louis, that would happen on a Jones Act covered barge. Next slide, please.
Jonathan, you're on the slides.
Okay.
And if you also, you're fine. If you wouldn't mind clicking right next to the zoom out button in the bottom right corner, just to do like a presentation mode, I think we'll be able to see them a bit clearer.
Yeah, for some reason I'm just not, so I know what you're referring to, and it's just not making itself available to me on this screen. Should I go to slideshow for the rest of it?
Sure.
I'll try that.
Yeah, and play from current slide.
away from current slide. There we are. All right.
Yeah, great.
We good? Thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank
Sorry
you,
about this
Jonathan.
again.
No worries.
All right. So another possible use or possible interaction between the Jones Act and the hydrogen hubs that are under development is using Jones Act ships to move hydrogen-based products other than fuels from hydrogen hubs that are in development to other markets in the United States. And so one market that leaps to mind in this instance is agricultural markets. A key off-taker for hydrogen is the ammonia industry. The application of ammonia is a key component in the overall GHG emissions associated with the farm sector. And so using ammonia that's made from hydrogen that's produced through zero carbon or low carbon production processes makes a lot of sense. We haven't quite figured out what the policy mechanism would be for that in the United States and elsewhere in the world, but that's something that we're going to need to solve. And when we do, the regional clean hydrogen hubs will have hopefully a new significant market for their fuels among farmers and more immediately among the ammonia terminals that are located throughout the Midwest, particularly those on river routes. And so in the picture here, you have the Harvest, which is a complex liquefied ammonia transport barge that was built in 2017, the first of its type that was built in the United States since 1982. So there has been some recent development in capacity for moving ammonia throughout United States waterways. Another application of this might be for industrial facilities that are using hydrogen in place of natural gas in process heaters, or hydrogen in place of natural gas for process inputs, and potentially in steelmaking. Ideally, vessels like the Harvest, the next generation vessels like the Harvest, would be powered by hydrogen or ammonia. So that's the final interaction that I want to talk about today, is using hydrogen, ammonia, or other hydrogen-based fuels to power Jones Act ships. And so for that to happen, there needs to be a deployment of new propulsion systems and new fuel storage systems on vessels and barges. There's a lot of activity, a lot of discussion around this in the international context, particularly in the cargo and bulk carrier segments of the shipping sector. But the same questions, many of the same technological questions apply to, in technological opportunities, apply to domestic intra-US Jones Act covered vessels. And as in the international shipping market, we think that some of the first movers are likely to be vessels that are already carrying hydrogen, or perhaps even sooner, that are carrying ammonia. And so in the United States, there's a couple early adopters that are moving in that direction. One is a joint, I don't know if it's a joint venture or not, a partnership between Amogy, which is a technology developer headquartered in New York that's focused on ammonia fueled energy systems, and Southern Naval, which is a US carrier that operates a huge fleet of US Jones Act covered fleets on intra-US waterways. They are working together to retrofit an ammonia barge that's very similar to the one that's pictured on this slide. To do that, they will take ammonia that the ship is carrying, crack it into hydrogen using Amogy's technology, and then run that hydrogen through a fuel cell that would power the barge. Another opportunity along these lines is to retrofit existing tankers, ammonia tankers that go between US ports via ocean routes. And one example might be moving ammonia from the US Gulf Coast to new demand centers in the US West Coast. On ammonia tankers. And so the technology that is getting the most attention in the international context there is using ammonia as a fuel in modified internal combustion engines, 2-stroke or 4-stroke engines, probably 2-stroke engines. And some of the companies that are out in front of that process, not surprisingly, are the companies that make and move ammonia. Those include Nutrien, Yara, and OCI. So that's it for my presentation. Thanks for listening. Thanks for bearing with me on the technical difficulties. I'm sorry about that. I look forward to hearing from Madeline and taking any questions that people have at the end.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Elise. I'll just say I'm not even as brave as Jonathan and Elise, and have really rejected the whole concept of slides in a digital world, because they make me very anxious. So I'm just going to be providing some sort of top line remarks with our beautiful faces today, just to kind of close us out and think about how do we operationalize these new findings and this opportunity of a Decarbonized Jones Act. So my name is Madeline Rose. I'm the Climate Campaign Director for Pacific Environment. We are a global nonprofit headquartered in California, and we really focus on running local to global campaigns that put in place real operational capacity to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway for the climate future. And we do a lot of work right now around maritime decarbonization and port decarbonization. So my remarks today will really focus on, how do we take this exciting new research from ICCT and actually operationalize it with a specific focus on California and the West Coast, which is our area of expertise. So I'm going to focus on kind of three big takeaways, three big areas of focus, which is one, what can Hawaii, California, and Washington do right now to create that Pacific corridor identified in the ICCT study? Number two, how can Washington and Alaska accelerate to operationalize the RoRo corridor identified? And then number three, how can California as a policymaker and a climate leader do more to realize this whole opportunity of Jones Act zero emission corridors? So point number one, Hawaii, California, and Washington. The ICCT study identifies the ports of Los Angeles, California, Seattle, Washington, and Honolulu, Hawaii as three key ports in this whole opportunity of West Coast Jones Act shipping corridors. This is a fantastic coalition of states to actually make real difficult climate-friendly ideas come to life. So we're super excited about this finding. All three states have climate forward policies, climate forward political leadership, and existing policies and programs on the books already working to decarbonize their on-road fleets of cars and trucks, of course, but also their ports and maritime. So the ICCT study specifically focuses on just a couple of ships that you are talking about that are moving regularly between these two corridors. And in the world of maritime shipping, that's particularly exciting, right? Because often we're thinking about 50,000 boats or these huge numbers, right? But what's exciting about this focus on these place-based corridors is we're just talking about a couple of ships. So what would it really take for Hawaii, California, and Washington to do this? Well, we have one specific idea, which is that last year, the governors of California, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, Canada, signed a new memorandum of understanding to collaborate on maritime decarbonization and port decarbonization through a regional compact that they've been working on for over 15 years together, which is called the Pacific Coast Collaborative. So the Pacific Coast Collaborative, they have their own website. It's sort of a mechanism to facilitate multi-state collaboration on shared regional climate issues. So while they've committed initially to maritime and port decarbonization, they haven't really picked priority projects yet. So we really recommend that the states work together, loop in Hawaii, and really leverage this opportunity of a focused Jones Act green shipping project as one of the first practical projects they could operationalize as part of this regional commitment. And sort of what's the impetus, right? again, because this is such a sort of small number of ships that we're talking about, it's really perfect for a first proof of concept opportunity. We know that California is already working to decarbonize their ferry fleet and their hovercraft fleet, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But once, we're starting to see that once you get just a first few ships moving and making that transition, you all of a sudden start to catalyze the fuel infrastructure transition, the ports transition, the safety approvals transition, like the certifications, all the things that need to happen to get a vessel on water has to start with just one, right? And so if we can start with just these three states, just this Hawaii, Washington, California corridor, you're going to all of a sudden attract the supply chain for wind assist propulsion to California. You're going to attract more green hydrogen fuel supply demand to the various ports. And you're going to start to just build that whole supply chain that we're going to need to decarbonize ultimately every vessel on the water. So again, really would want to underscore to the Pacific Coast Collaborative and to Washington, California, and Hawaii to really dig into the study, to work with ICCT, and the Pacific Environment is here to support you to really do what it takes to operationalize this corridor. Point number 2 is about what Washington and Alaska can do to operationalize the findings of this study. So in addition to the California, Hawaii, Washington opportunity, we're super excited by this Washington, Alaska opportunity. The specific vessel that Elise mentioned is a ro-ro, which is a roll-on, roll-off auto carrier. And ro-ros are generally perceived to be particularly well placed for corridor work, for green shipping corridor work, because while many other types of cargo ships may stop at like 7 different ports in their voyage, or end up kind of moving their route to go somewhere different. Ro-ros are very much point A to point B, right? They go from one port back and forth moving cars. So it's a relatively simple problem statement to solve in terms of thinking about the fuel supply that you need on either side of that corridor. In addition, the ports of Seattle and the ports of Juneau in Alaska have already entered into a green shipping corridor agreement for their cruise business. So every year there's about 9 to 13 cruise ships that go back and forth from Seattle to Juneau, and the 2 ports and the 2 states have already agreed to work with cruise companies to decarbonize that corridor. So it's really a win-win moment and opportunity for the ports to do comprehensive master planning, not just of their cruise business, but also of their ro-ro business, and make sure that they design new bunkering build-out policies that are going to leverage the same fuel source for all of these fleet types. In addition to the just obvious emissions benefits from the maritime decarbonization opportunity, these findings are really important to us because they can also help keep Alaska's remaining fossil fuels in the ground. So right now, there's a big push in Alaska to extract more crude oil and more fracked gas out of Alaska, because the state sees it as its only revenue generation opportunity. However, a previous ICCT study from 2022 found that there's significant demand for hydrogen refueling for the Trans-Pacific fleet in Alaska, specifically out on the Aleutian Island chain. And this is an opportunity for Alaskan political leadership and Alaskan businesses to really lean into a clean energy revenue stream and a clean energy opportunity to finally move the state away from perpetual reliance on fossil fuel extraction, right? We know that IPCC science tells us that every remaining fossil fuel needs to stay in the ground if we have any chance at achieving a 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming target, and that includes Alaska. And so, we have a team up in Alaska that has been working really hard to convince Alaskan policymakers to see this opportunity to develop and produce electrolytic green hydrogen, and see maritime as a buyer of those fuels to help mitigate against commercial offers to take new fossils out of the ground. So really excited to see, just continued demonstration in research that this is possible, and that there are going to be even more ships that could buy this fuel source. So then finally, on sort of point number 3 on the California front, just wanted to really emphasize and underscore that California has a unique opportunity to lead here. Of course, we all know well that California has a long history of setting world first and nation first regulations to accelerate transportation decarbonization. And while they get, a lot more visibility for the current work on cars and trucks, they also do have a long history of regulating the global shipping industry. So in 2007 and 2008, the California Air Resources Board passed the world's most ambitious clean shipping regulations. At the time, they passed the world's first sulfur fuel standard for ship fuels, requiring a significant reduction in sulfur emissions from ocean-going vessels, and they passed the world's first at-berth emissions regulations. So essentially the first ever cap on the amount of air pollution that was allowed from ships in port. Those policies have been adopted globally at the IMO, at the United Nations entity that regulates shipping, as well as in many countries around the world. So China now has a California-aligned at-berth regulation, and the European Union is now moving forward to have a California-aligned at-berth regulation. So we're now calling on California to once again embrace their history as a leader on zero-emission shipping regulation. And currently, CARB is looking to develop a new regulation for all large ocean-going vessels that use California ports or traverse California waters. And they're looking to begin rulemaking for a new zero-emission standard this summer or fall. So would really, welcome everyone in the audience today to please help us with that campaign. It's going to be a big fight. We need the companies, fuel suppliers, advocates, everyone really focused on this opportunity for a new zero emission regulation for ships in California. Of course, germane to the webinar today is that while the majority of those vessels would be internationally flagged vessels, it would also include the Jones Act fleet. So this would be another opportunity to help operationalize the findings of this research and really support push and create the conditions to make sure that those Jones Act ships are starting to transition on a timeline with the rest of the global fleet. So all the work that we can do now to, as Elise said towards the end of her comments, really make sure we're supporting American shipyards to build this next generation of ships and various stakeholders to retrofit as needed is certainly going to be of interest. So just to close, really wanted to underscore just our excitement for this opportunity and the imperative for the West Coast to really operationalize these findings. And yeah, excited to take any questions that come up in Q&A or follow up by email.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Elise, Jonathan, Madeline, you have opened up a lovely discussion and dialogue here, and it was wonderful to see you all kind of connecting your points to each other. Now we would like to include the audience on the line with a Q&A. I've already had some questions come in, but as a reminder, everyone, if you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them in the questions box in your control panel. And we'll get to as many as we can before we run out of time. First question here, why do you focus on hydrogen as a marine fuel instead of ammonia?
I can take that since I kind of talk on both. So we focused on hydrogen in this study. We had a pre-existing methodology on hydrogen, and we're still waiting to see some ammonia technology evolve to see. We know that both hydrogen and ammonia could be used in internal combustion engines. With any combustion, there'll be nitrous oxides that are produced. But with ammonia, there's a little bit more of gray area of how clean the entire fuel life cycle can be. And since ammonia is a byproduct of hydrogen production, we focus just on the source for this paper, but we are exploring ammonia as a fuel as it continues to develop in its technology. And Jonathan, I know you spoke a lot on ammonia in yours. Did you want to touch on ammonia as a maritime fuel?
Yeah, I mean, we think both fuels have promise. The main advantage I would say that ammonia has over hydrogen is that it's easier to store and carry on a vessel, particularly on a vessel where space comes at a premium. It's the purpose of the vessel is to carry other things on its own fuel. and ammonia is a little bit more compatible with that. However, Elise, I just want to echo Elise's point that we're waiting to see an ammonia fueled vessel actually demonstrated. CATF has been pushing this for years. 3 of my colleagues just got back from Denmark and Norway in a series of meetings with technology developers there, try to get a better sense on what's the delay so far in the sort of commercial application of this technology, which the industry has been looking at for a long time now. There are important questions that need to be answered in terms of performance, emissions, safety, and the best way to answer those is to get some pilot demonstrations on the water, or at least on test beds in labs around the world. And we're very eager to see that. We think most of the challenges are addressable, and we think ammonia has significant promise, but we also think there are applications for hydrogen as well, and the Amogy technology that I mentioned earlier, in which you carry the fuel as ammonia, but then you transition it to hydrogen to be used in a fuel cell, also holds promise.
Great. In a similar vein, have you considered methanol, particularly e-methanol, as a hydrogen carrier fuel? Maybe a similar answer here.
We've definitely been looking into methanol as a marine fuel. With many kind of bio-based fuels, it goes into the feedstock. So we just have to be mindful when we're talking about methanol, biomethanol, e-methanol, that the feedstocks not only are sustainable, but can be scalable for maritime. And so while we're keeping an eye on it for sure, for scalability, sometimes we're thinking of like things that are being implemented economy-wide, like hydrogen.
All right, next question here. Could you comment on how the IRA could help accelerate the Jones Act transition?
I'll take it to either my more policy forward panelists.
Well, I'll make a quick point around hydrogen production, which is that, I talked about hydrogen hubs as a policy for testing and developing a suite of technologies and business models around the production, storage, and use of hydrogen-based products. We think that model is really important for getting some of these new technologies and new applications into the market as soon as possible, and building relationships or proto relationships between the producers and the end users, so that the shipping industry gets comfortable working with the hydrogen industry to figure out how they're going to decarbonize that service. But ultimately, the scale up of hydrogen production in the United States is probably going to owe at least as much, perhaps much more, to the hydrogen production tax credit, which is a hugely powerful tool for accelerating the production of low carbon hydrogen in the United States. And so it's another area where the United States, as Elise described earlier, the United States shipping industry has sort of been enfeebled over the last decades, but the United States is in a very strong position to be a supplier of low cost, low carbon marine fuel. And so there's an opportunity here for the industry, in part jump-started by the hydrogen production tax credit and the Inflation Reduction Act, to take back a bigger share, play a bigger role, hopefully a positive role in the both domestic and global shipping.
Yeah, and I would just add, in addition to the hydrogen hubs and the hydrogen tax credit funding streams, would also highlight the Climate Smart Ports funding line that was made available in the IRA bill. So this was originally a piece of legislation that was introduced as standalone by Congresswoman Barragan of Los Angeles, which was eventually folded into the final IRA and the climate provision. It's about a $3.5 billion fund for port transformation for a climate smart future. So this is $3.5 billion that's being made available right now to ports for all of the projects that they need to do to prepare for new electric equipment, essentially. So we're talking about, actually buying new electric cranes or electric trucks, but also doing port master plan projects for a renewable energy future, or piloting a new hydrogen bunkering infrastructure, or actually building a new hydrogen bunkering system or a barge. So there's a lot of leeway, and there's a sort of a wide range. It doesn't go so far as funding a new vessel build, though Pacific Environment and a number of our allies, including CATF, are currently working in DC to develop a new funding stream for zero-emission ship builds subsidies and grant support for future appropriation cycles. But for now, in addition to the hydrogen money, there is a lot of ports money beyond just that climate smart ports line. There's also just a ton of EPA community funds and community block grants, essentially, that are going to be going out. We're working with a number of port communities around the country who will be applying for funds from those programs to be able to advocate and work with the port to develop projects that the community and the port agree on, like electric charging stations. So yeah, there's this is a historic moment, as we all know, and we really need to all be doing everything that we can to make sure that the right stakeholders are going after these available funds.
Great, thank you. Madeline, a clarification question for you. Did you say that there is a green hydrogen project underway in Alaska? And if so, where is it?
So the project I mentioned is there's a green corridor project between the Port of Seattle and the Port of Juneau, and it's an initial green cruise corridor project. There are also a few hydrogen production projects going on in Alaska. Yes, none of them, they're currently pretty community focused. So there's a project out in Adak, sort of outside the Port of Adak, that's looking at sort of community, just basic energy for community purposes. So there hasn't yet been any support in the stakeholders that we've talked to about going to sort of commercial scale, so producing enough hydrogen for large scale off-takers like ships. But the Anchorage Airport is also looking at some hydrogen production possibilities, because the Anchorage Airport is still one of the fifth largest cargo airport in the US. So we think that there's a lot of opportunity and interest, but historically Alaska has been a tough place to get clean energy money. So yeah, for whoever asked that question, we'd love to follow up, and we're trying to help play a matchmaker role for some of the stakeholders in Alaska who really are trying to get support for green hydrogen production.
Great. Another question here. Is it economically feasible for ship owners to retrofit their vessels to decarbonize? Or economically, would it realistically mean new builds for the entire fleet?
So one of the reasons why I focused on age, because many of these Jones Act fleet are towards the end of their life cycles. They're running on assumably lesser efficient technologies because they're 30, 40 years old. In cases like that, those will probably be more new builds, unless they're on fresh water and they still have loads of life ahead of them. Retrofits, I think, are going to be more cases of ships that are more newly built, but try to take on bridging technologies such as LNG and scrubbers, things that about 10, 15 years ago we were thinking were the solutions, but were really just bridges to zero emission. Those will be having to be retrofitted in the future if they want to go completely zero emission, to either capturing the emissions they're still releasing, or switching to cleaner fuels. And this is to say it's not easy to retrofit a ship, but if it's polluting in a zero emission area, there'll have to be found solutions.
And so if I could just add there, just to say, in the years that I've worked on shipping, we've been told every year, like too expensive, no way, we're not going to retrofit the whole fleet. However, a few weeks ago, Maersk just announced that they are exploring a systematic retrofit of their existing commercial fleet for methanol, because we are in a climate crisis and we don't have time to do a whole new build of every single ship on the water and wait, quite frankly. So they just further announced this morning that they are beginning their first retrofit project to look to transition a conventional fuel engine to a dual fuel methanol engine that would be e-methanol capable. So there's if you Google Maersk press room right now, this just came out a few hours ago, and they're going to be doing the engine retrofit next year in 2024. So again, these are capital intensive projects. They are going to be anyways, but we have to keep our North Star on the emissions produced every year by the industry and make sure we're doing what it takes to bring those down.
And if I could just tag on to that as well, CATF is putting out a tool on how the capital and operational costs of transitioning to zero emission vessels can be managed, and we're imagining a sort of a multi-step process, and that was part of the point of our discussion with Maersk in Copenhagen a couple of weeks ago, is sort of run our assumptions by them. And I just want to echo what Madeline was saying. They previewed some of what they've announced. There's retrofits that were seemingly off the table in discussions a couple of years ago are sort of very much under consideration.
Well, that is some exciting news. Elise, did you? Sorry.
Yeah, and I just want to say that's the next step in kind of this Jones Act series for myself, is looking into total cost of ownership of American-built zero-emission vessel, because for years now we've been hearing it's so expensive, it's so expensive. I'm really curious of what the actual number is. So that's what my next job is.
Awesome. I think one final question here before we wrap up. How would decarbonizing the Jones Act fleet influence the global shipping decarbonization effort overall? So kind of big picture implications here.
So the US itself, the US flagships itself are not huge in the emissions inventory of global shipping. But that's not to say they don't have an impact outside our domestic waters. If we can show proof of concept in our domestic waters, we can go to allies and we can go to the IMO and show that this is possible. So while it's not the biggest emission-wise, it greatly impacts the communities that they directly affect, and it can be fodder for future ships that may be the larger slice of global shipping emissions.
I would say, yeah, I'll go back to a point that we made a few minutes ago, which is that it's not a huge fleet. It's there's not a lot of fleet ownership in the United States, but because of some of the provisions in the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States is going to be a source of low carbon marine fuel going forward, and that's going to create opportunities that didn't previously exist. And so there's likely to be changes in the global marketplace that happen, that are more likely, parts of it are more likely to happen in the United States than it used to be. And so, and that includes the hubs program that I ran through, the hydrogen production tax credit, the funding that's available for ports and other infrastructure to develop the bunkering facilities and the storage facilities that you'll need to fuel transition both Jones Act fleets and fleets that serve international markets. And so I think there's the United States. I mean, this would be quite a 180, but the United States has an opportunity here to go from being sort of one of the less technologically sophisticated fleets in the world to at least aspects of it being on the cutting edge and demonstrating new technologies that will have relevance to shipping markets around the world.
Any final thoughts to add, Madeline?
I think they both said it well, but just to to really emphasize like the technology community in the transportation space. It's on the one hand, it's large, like we're talking about, you know, millions and millions of vessels, from cars to trucks to trains around the planet. But at the end of the day, it's also kind of small, right? So like the evolution of ship engines come from rail engines, and there's like a big relationship between rail and heavy duty trucks and shipping. And you know, the folks that are building zero emission ferries here in San Diego are, you know, very close with the folks that are building zero emission ferries in Norway and Australia and New Zealand. Like it actually is a pretty small ecosystem from a technology perspective. And again, you know, while we don't have the US doesn't have the biggest shipping fleet, we do have one of the world's most advanced and aggressive and ambitious technology economies and technology innovation clusters. And so we, you know, I've been spending a lot of time in the East Asia shipyards this year, and it's sort of this funny saying where everyone says, we don't want to go first, but we don't want to be last. So we're, you know, we want to be like second or third, and just kind of everyone's following each other. I think one of the powerful things about the American economy is that like we do want to go first. We do want to take risks. We do want to test new technologies and try to find solutions, right? And we have this moment under the Biden administration where that truly is reflected at the highest levels of government. We have that in California. We have that in the industry right now. You know, folks are building zero emission ferries. They're building zero emission barges, like Jonathan mentioned, like the Amagi technology. So, you know, it could still be a really powerful area of technology breakthrough that the US could lead here. You know, as Jonathan said, we have all the ingredients, and hopefully we can do it.
Lovely. Well, I think that is a great point to finish on. Thank you, Elise, Jonathan, and Madeline. You have done such a wonderful job. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Our email is communications@theicct.org, or you can use the contact form on our website and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Remember to also follow us at the ICCT. Thanks again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.